All right, guys. All right, guys. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. So today is Wednesday, May 13th, and this is Physiology. So today, what I wanted to discuss with you guys is just a couple of updates first about the module that we're finishing up. So let's just go ahead and look at our Schoology page. So first, I made a couple of changes. Nothing too major, just to reflect what's going on with the school closures. So I made a new folder called, well, actually, I split one folder in two. So your old assignments folder, I made one called assignments prior to the COVID school closure. So that'll be everything before we left. So that's from the beginning of winter semester to March 13th when we left. So if you look on here, it is everything that you did, starting with the class materials I collected the first day of school, January 17th, to your last notebook check and participation points for March 13th when we were in class. Now, your second folder, titled Assignments After COVID-19 School Closures, just reflects everything that we've been doing since then, since March 16th. And so it's been these three modules up to this point. The nervous module is the one we're working on. And we're finishing up this module this week, actually. And so next week, we're going to work on our last module, which is the lymphatic and the immune system module. So let's go ahead and take a look at the nervous system module. And nothing different here. I just wanted to update you on where you are progress-wise. So like I said on Monday, the notes obviously are in your notes folder. The assignments we've worked on to this point, we started this module 2 weeks ago now. We're finishing this week. We started with a look at what concussions are with this brain pop video. Then we had a discussion about the nervous system itself using this crash course video. And these were both Zoom discussion groups, breakout groups. And then Monday we watched one last one, and this will be the last video for brain trauma and concussions, etc. And it's a PBS video that we watched along with the discussion questions attached for every single Zoom discussion. And that was it for the little Zoom discussions. Everything else is now on you, assignments that are worth points, because these videos are just meant to be watched. But these are actual assignments that are past due up to this point. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting zeros for those that haven't turned them in. And grades have been submitted, so it won't be reflected on the last report card, but it will be for the upcoming report card. So if you haven't already done your May 8th crash course video worksheet on central and peripheral systems, please do that now. It's overdue. And I'll go ahead and start sending out phone calls for missing work. For your reading assignment, there was one Newsella article on the central nervous system that was due on Monday. And again, there was two writing assignments for that. So there was the ELA prompt and the science writing prompt. So both of those are past due. I understand that it is AP week, so some people are probably a little busy with that. So I'll probably hold off till like Friday or so to start making phone calls home for missing work. But if you're watching this video, please make sure that you know and that you're checking your calendar, because all of these are past due. Okay, a lot of you already did, most of you actually did this one already. This was last week, but now this week, again, I know we're in AP mode, so these are behind by a lot of people. So I'll be a little more patient for these, and I'll send out an email to everyone before I call home just to see if you've had a chance to start. So that takes care of the assignments for the nervous system module. Everything else now is going to be assessment, right? So your formative assessment is published. I have scheduled the date for May 15th. That's this Friday. Your discussion board, you can go ahead and do that on your own. I had put that for today, and some students have started that already. All you need to do for this one is watch the videos that are posted in the assignment folder, like it says here. After you've read chapter 8 and 9, watch the videos, even read the article that I posted for Newsella. You're going to post your own questions about L1, L2, and L3. So your L1 questions are questions that are straight from the text. So text in this case could also be video. So if you want to ask something as simple as like, what causes concussions, right? That would be an L1 question because whoever's answering that can get the answer to that directly from the video or text or book. An L2 question is something that relates to a theme, to a core topic, right? So for my athletes, this could be something that relates to you. You could ask something about who's more likely to get concussions, etc. That would be an L2 question. And L3 questions, L3 referring to level 3, are the most deep questions. They're the ones that connect to the self. So it could be a question something like, um, do you think you've ever had a concussion? Why or why not? Something like that. So again, as usual, your rubric is attached here. And for this one, I need specific cited evidence. So I will not give credit or full credit to people who are just blurting out answers. I need them to be directly cited from whatever I've assigned, be it a video, an article, or something that came up during a discussion. So again, a student already posted theirs. Now it's your job to respond, okay? So that takes care of the discussion board. And then your last assignment for this, I already finished grading every single endocrine system summative assessment, and they were great. Some of you got very creative with them. And so we're going to do the same thing as we had discussed before for the nervous system. So the nervous system, we read this Monday and Wednesday. It's going to be the same deal where you're going to pick which of the nervous system pathologies you want to work on, and then create me a 5 to 10 minute video or 10 to 15 slide digital presentation. Most of you did the digital presentation last time, which is fine. So it's your choice, and here's the rubric, okay? And if you forgot what the pathologies of the nervous system are, they're actually found right here in my notes. So let me stop sharing this screen with you so I can show you what the pathologies are. So let's go into your notes folder. So we'll go, sorry. Okay, so we're gonna look at, there we go. So this is the pathology for the nervous system topics that you can choose from. And so I've been focusing a lot on concussions as relates to students that play sports in particular, right? But again, any of these are fair game. I know ALS is something that was really big in the news a couple of years ago with the ice bucket challenge, things like that. But some of these are nervous system pathologies you're most likely familiar with, and again, they were in the reading. So feel free to choose any that you would like. Same as last time, you're going to work with a group of 2 to 3 or independently. It's up to you. And so that's going to conclude the nervous system module. So if you have any questions about that, please make sure that you reach out to me. But I'll be expecting your assignments this week. And the due date that I published for the summative assessment nervous system is going to be next week. Okay, so next Wednesday. So as of today, that's it. There's no new assignments other than your discussion board, which you're simply posting questions and answering, and then your summative video or digital presentation. Okay, so if you have any questions, please make sure you email me. But other than that, that concludes that. So all I wanted to do today, for those of you that are watching, is just go ahead and cover our last set of notes for the nervous system. Okay, so where we left off last time, we finished talking about the entire sensory, motor, and interneuron relationship. We talked about um, reflex arcs. We talked about how there's communication in the form of neurotransmitters that are sent from a presynaptic neuron to a postsynaptic neuron via a synaptic cleft or a synaptic gap. And now I want to talk specifically about the systems. So the system that we're going to start with, that's covered in chapter 9, is the central nervous system. And I have said this before, the spinal cord is essentially just a large bundle of neurons that we call a ganglion. But what I want to focus on is the brain itself. So for the brain, there are 3 developmental areas. And from those 3, as adults, we get these 4. and in parentheses, I put what was what prior. So for example, the forebrain as an adult, that turns into the cerebrum, but your forebrain also turns into this other section we'll look at called the diencephalon. Your midbrain turns into what we call the brainstem and associated parts, which we'll look at. And then the hindbrain turned into our cerebellum as adults. So let's go ahead and take a look at these, okay? So in the cerebrum, aka what used to be the forebrain, the cerebrum is what we look at and think of as the traditional brain. It's the outer grayer mantle of the brain, and it looks like this. Okay, so this is your cerebrum, but your cerebrum is made of different parts, obviously. So there's a wrinkly outer layer to the cerebrum, which we call the cerebral cortex, or the cerebral cortex, or all of these large gummy looking worms on the surface of your brain that are very soft. And on the cerebral cortex, there are these little wrinkles. We call those wrinkles here, we call them the gyri. And then the large grooves in between those gyri, we call the sulci or the sulcus is one, sulci is plural. So the cerebral cortex itself is then divided into different regions. So again, this is the cerebral cortex. And then if you were to look at the different sections of it, which we refer to as lobes, there are 4 lobes, which I'll highlight here for you in red. So we have our frontal lobe, and we discussed this before. The lobes of the cerebral cortex actually are named after the parts of the cranium they're found under. So the frontal lobe is found under the frontal bone. Your parietal lobe is found underneath the parietal bone. Your occipital lobe is found beneath the occipital bone of the cranium, and the temporal lobe is found beneath the temporal bone of the cranium. So hopefully all that sounds familiar, because it's something we covered in depth last semester before we went on our winter break, and that was in the skeletal system. So again, your lobes of your cerebral cortex are those 4. And the cerebral cortex itself not only has lobes, but it has an associated left and right side, because your brain is not just one single mass. It's actually 2 hemispheres, which we call the cerebral hemispheres, which are divided in the middle. And here, so if we look at this lateral view, we're only looking at one side of your brain. But if we look at an anterior or even a posterior view, we can see that there is a left and a right. Okay, and the division between the hemispheres, we call that the longitudinal fissure, as you can see here in this picture. Now, the connection between the left and the right, we call the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum, you can't see it here on the outer view of the brain, but if you imagine in between here, which you can see this little dotted line kind of cutout area, the corpus callosum is the middle connection between the left and the right that unites the 2 hemispheres of your cerebrum. Okay, so that takes care of the cerebrum. I just wanted to show you now a picture of the lobes and let you know that the lobes, and actually your cerebral cortex is I know I talked about this before. Your cerebral cortex is really the reason that you're able to do everything that you do as a student: play sports, conduct music, play video games, read books, learn calculus. Your cerebral cortex, this is where higher order thinking occurs. This is something that is referred to by some as the mammalian brain. It's what allows us to do all of these wonderful things that other life forms, for example, like reptiles, don't have a cerebral cortex like us. So we refer to our brain as the mammalian brain because of all of the additional regions that we have that allow us to do things that other animals can't do like us. So our frontal lobe, as you can see here, which is color coded in orange, the frontal lobe allows us to do all of these things, and in parentheses are the associated areas on the brain, which I'll show you in a second how to find. So your frontal lobe is in control of motor, problem solving, and speech. And I'm going to show you a website that you can use to help you identify these regions in 3D. But for now, let me just color code. So your frontal lobe is in control of these functions, again, in this part of your brain. Your temporal lobe, which is color coded in pink, which is found right around your temple or ear area, is in charge of auditory processing, and that makes sense because that's where our ears are. But is also in charge of language comprehension, which we call Wernicke's area, and memory. So what's important to note about the lobes and lobe function is in terms of your summative assessment project. So if you choose to do something like a concussion or stroke, and if a patient has TBI or traumatic brain injury to, let's say, the temporal lobe, well, that could affect this area, which we call Wernicke's area, which I'll show you in a bit, and that would affect the way that they comprehend language. Okay, so I was saying this on Monday. The reason that we know about brain function is because of brain injury. So when people damage these sections of the brain, they tend to lose these functions, and so that's how we were able to figure out what the brain does. Because things like MRI, uh, which are magnetic resonance images, are kind of like how we take pictures of the brain, but they don't necessarily show us what's happening inside the brain. So what we know about brain function, like this image here, comes from what we unfortunately discovered by patients being injured. The parietal lobe, which is this blue area here, is in control of touch perception, I'm sorry, body orientation, and sensory discrimination, meaning it's how we're able to feel our way around the world. The occipital lobe, which is the back of our brain, the posterior region of our brain, is in charge of sight. So for my football players, athletes, anyone who's ever fallen down and bumped the back of their head, if you see spots, if your vision goes blurry, it's because this is where sight is actually controlled in your brain. And I know that seems kind of awkward because your eyeballs are here in the front, but it's because you have, I'll just sketch this out, you have your eyeballs over here. So I'll exaggerate this. So you have your eyeballs here. Okay, there's your eyeballs. And then you have a large optic nerve that travels through the brain to the occipital lobe. Okay. And so if you, again, look at people who fall down, injure the back of their head or the occipital lobe region of the brain, that's why they their vision gets affected. And then lastly, your two bottom sections are the cerebellum, which we're going to look at in a bit, and the brainstem. So the cerebellum, color coded red here, is in charge of balance and coordination. So those motor functions that we take for granted, the cerebellum, are also controlled down here. And then your brainstem is something that we've been talking about in terms of involuntary responses. So we'll take a look at that. So let me go ahead and walk you guys over to the um, this website here that I wanted to show you guys. So this website here is called brainfacts.org, and I put it in your website folder, the pink folder. And this is going to be really helpful for helping you guys understand in 3D with, without being in the classroom, without having a model in front of us. It helps you to visualize not just the brain in 3 dimension, but to understand the different regions of the brain. So what's really cool about this is if you have a little drop down here. So we're looking at the hemispheres, for example. So if you click on the right cerebral hemisphere, it highlights it for you. Or it shows it to you. If we're looking at the frontal lobe, right, it highlights it for you. And again, you can move around in different directions there to get different views of it. Okay. The other cool thing about this is, like I said, some of these areas, like the one I said that's in control of sight in your occipital lobe, they're kind of hard to see. So what this does is it highlights for you, and kind of gives you a 3D view of it. So that's a cool little website you can use. When we were in the classroom, I like to use the app that I installed on your iPads for looking at the brain in 3 dimension. But unfortunately, we're not in class, so we can't we can't look at it anymore. But I provided this in your website folder just in case you don't have your iPads with you. But if you have your iPads with you, please use it to understand the different lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, so that takes care of the cerebrum. And now we have 3 more sections to go for the brain. So now let's look at the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is it has different names. So for us, when we are in the developmental stage of our nervous system, like I told you, it's known as the forebrain. It's underneath the cerebrum, and it's not actually just one part. It's actually 2 regions of the brain. We've been speaking about one of them, the hypothalamus. That's the region of the brain that's in charge of homeostasis. And the thalamus is essentially like the relay messenger between what comes into the brain as far as a response from the outside world, and then what to do with it. So the thalamus is kind of the in between that receives signals and then gives out responses. And then the hypothalamus is in charge of making sure that the brain is regulated, that the body is functioning normally. So that's what we call the diencephalon, and I'll show you a picture of it here. So looking at a cross section, a lateral view of it here. So if we were to cut the brain um, in half, sagitally, if we had one in class, if we were in class, we would see that, again, this is the corpus callosum, like we said at the beginning. There are these sections here that we call the thalamus here. Oops. So here's your thalamus, and here's the hypothalamus. So that's what we refer to as the diencephalon. But as you can see in my notes, there is more than one name for this. And back in the day, I think this is the 1960s, there was a neuropsychologist who um, was studying the brain and came up with this model of the brain that used to be referred to as the triune system. And in that model, or in his model, he said there were essentially 3 regions of the brain that had 3 systems. And one of those systems he referred to as the limbic system. This is something that some of you might have heard of before, because it is referred to as the emotional brain. This is where anger, fear, aggression are believed to be controlled by the brain. And the regions of the brain associated with that limbic system are the amygdala, the hippocampus, which is where memory is stored. Amygdala is where emotions and anger are supposedly where they stem from. The thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the reason I put it in quotes is because this system, it's not covered in our book, and a lot of this is mostly from the field of neuroscience, not really anatomy. So we're not going to talk too much more about it because we're just looking at the facts, right? The bare bones. But not everyone agrees with that old model of the brain, because it turns out that there's much more to it than just those systems we call the limbic system, and the other 2, which I'm not going to mention because, again, they're not covered in our book. So for now, that's why I put it in quotes. I'm not going to talk about the limbic system anymore, but the parts of the brain are important to note. And so on this picture, um, you can see the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so the regions exist, but how they work is a little debated in the world of psychology in particular, and this is not a psychology class. So for now, we're just going to stick to the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus, okay, so as seen here. The 3rd region of the brain is what we call the brain stem, and the brain stem is what used to be the midbrain, and it's made up of the midbrain itself, the pons, and the medulla. And so the midbrain, as you can see here in my notes, this is what is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, wake cycle, temperature regulation. Your pons is in between your forebrain and the cerebellum. So let's look at it here. So here is the midbrain. Okay, so the midbrain does all that important stuff that I just said. The pons is kind of just like this in between the midbrain and what's beneath your brain called the cerebellum. So it's kind of like the sender of signals between those two regions. But the medulla is different. The medulla is very important. It is the lowest half of your brain stem, and it is what controls your involuntary functions. So like breathing, heart rate. And in class, I know we mentioned this before, if you were to have an accident, if you were to, and you see this a lot when patients have a broken neck and they break the C1 or the C2 or the C3 vertebra, the vertebra that are closest to the skull. Um, that's where the medulla oblongata is housed, and because that is in control of things like heart rate and breathing, if you were to damage that essential part of the brain, then instantly that's why people die, because without the medulla doing its job, you actually stop breathing and your heart stops. So it's a scary region, but it is something that we need to be aware of as far as our brain stem, because we need to know how our bodies work. So that is the brain stem. And lastly is the very back of the brain, the posterior inferior part of the brain, which we call the cerebellum. And cerebellum just literally just means little brain. And the reason is because you can see in this picture, it kind of looks like a smaller little brain at the base of our brain. And so what that does is it receives sensory information. And because it's close to the spinal cord, it also regulates movement throughout our body. It also is the coordinator of movements such as posture, balance, and speech. So the cerebellum essentially is like a second brain to you. Okay, so that is the cerebellum there, and that concludes the brain structure. And like I said, for the spinal cord, I'm not going to say much more than it's just the base of the brain that traverses the entire body. And I know we've looked at it before, so I'll show you another picture, but not too much more to say about it. This is the spinal cord. What I really wanted to focus your attention on today was the brain itself. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to look at the entire brain, I'm going to pause there, because what I wanted to do on Friday was I wanted people to use your whiteboard, use some of the models and animations I've provided you to draw me and illustrate for me a brain with all of these red words highlighted. So that way you can, for yourself, be able to represent and model what it is and know what it does, because it will be covered on the test. Okay, so I'll go ahead and pause there. So again, make sure you watch this video so you know what the 4 regions of the brain are. And like I said, in Schoology, I have provided you guys with a website called 3D Brain that shows you all of the regions of the brain. Okay, so it highlights them all. So for example, there's the pons. But I also provided you, let me show you. If you go back into your um, pink website folder, I provided you that link on the 3D brain. And then I also provided you, for those of you interested in understanding what MRIs are, for those of you that are pre-med, this is a website that shows you what an MRI image would look like of those same regions. So for example, let's say we want to look at the cerebellum. So here I have it as a coronal view. We can do axial, we'll compare the two. Okay, so here is a coronal view, meaning this is looking at the skull. So if this were the skull, a coronal view would be cutting it this way. So this is the brain looking at it laterally. Coronal view would cut it this way. Okay, so if we look at the image here, highlighted in green is the cerebellum, and at the bottom there's a control for going And you can see it actually, let me highlight for you here. So you can see here on the far left, it shows you which part of the brain we're looking at. So right now we're in the posterior of the brain. And as I move this MRI machine through the brain, and that's actually what happens when you enter an MRI, the patient's head. So if this is the MRI, it's like a large, like a large magnet that it's a big chamber they enter into, and the MRI actually just scans the patient like that. So if we look at this image on the left here, you can see how it is traversing and showing you the brain. Okay, so right there, you can see here on the left that we're at the anterior view of the face. So obviously the cerebellum is not there, it's in the posterior. So you don't see it appear till we get closer to the posterior of the brain. And there it is, right? So there's your cerebellum. We can change the view. So we can do, rather than a coronal view, we can do a sagittal view. And a sagittal view is very different, right? So if this is a lateral view of our brain, rather than cutting coronal, which is what this is, a sagittal view will cut it this way. So essentially what that'll do is it'll give us a left and a right half of the brain. So if we look at the same structure, right? So here circled in red is the patient's head. And as you can see here, a sagittal view just gives us from the far left, and then we're entering the cerebellum, and then it's getting larger because we're getting into the center of it. And then what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get smaller, obviously, right? Because now we're going to be exiting the cerebellum. Okay, so again, I sent you this and the other website in your pink website folder, so please be sure to look at those, play around with it a little bit. But on Friday, what I want us to do is we'll be getting into Zoom breakout groups, and I'll have you each draw me your own model of the 4 regions of the brain and label the parts that I highlighted in my notes, okay? So I'll go ahead and stop the video there. If you have any questions, please make sure you reach out to me. And again, there are a couple assignments that are has to do for some people, but again, I know that it's AP week. A lot of you are busy with tests. I receive emails from people, so I'll hold off on calling home. But what I will do is just reach out to everyone through email today to follow up with you to see if you're aware of the assignments, and let me know if you need additional time or anything like that. Okay, but in the time, until then, see you guys on Friday, and I'll be available today and tomorrow if you guys want to talk. Okay, thank you guys.